With the introduction of SoloQ coming in pre-patch, and with SoloQ looking like it's going to be a much larger portion of the average player's gameplay in Dragonflight, I wanted to take a minute to outline a few steps that I think will be very useful for people who are just either getting into Arena competitive PvP for the first time, or people who haven't been participating in Arena for maybe years. Now, this isn't going to be like a detailed outline or guide of what to do or how to play each class or those kind of things. This is going to be more of a 4 major points that I think is especially important for anyone who's easing their way into PvP. This is going to be the sort of, I guess you could call it a guide on how to climb up to 1400, 1600, probably even 1800, particularly as an average PvEer. So the idea here is that you roughly know how to play your class and what your abilities do and things like that. And maybe you do a lot of keys or raid, and you're looking at doing PvP, competitive PvP now, because you want to fill out your vault each week and that kind of thing. So step 1 is going to be very simple, which is just queue. Just get into Arena. Try and take that stigma away of it always being hyper competitive that makes people wary of making mistakes. It's like they don't want to get involved because they don't want to fail. This is obviously easier said than done, but just accept that you're going to lose a lot, and losing doesn't matter. I think people who push high keys have a good understanding of this, whereas this is something that I think a lot of the average Mythic Pluses will struggle with, in that if they start their weekly 15 or whatever, they go in with the expectation that every key should be a timed key. Whereas I think people who push high keys, I mean, the higher you go, I guess the more this is true, in that it's very easy to fail keys, and failing keys isn't a big deal. Whereas I think for the average, weekly 15 no lever kind of crowd, failing a key feels like a big loss. Now, the more you step into Arena, the more games you lose, hopefully the less importance you're going to place on winning or losing. At the end of the day, Arena isn't actually about winning more games. It's about losing to better people. Even the best players in the world, the BlizzCon champions, still lose half of their games. So a big part of just getting into Arena is dispelling this stigma that losing is bad, because losing isn't bad. You're going to lose a lot. As long as you learn from those losses and you lose to better and better opponents over time, you are succeeding in PvP. I would say a good first step to this mentality is to set small goals for yourself that are independent of winning or losing. And they can be quite like simple things, like having a goal of you want to press a particular cooldown when the opposing team presses their cooldowns. Or even something like your goal is to go into Arena, especially if you're just learning and starting out in Arena. Your goal is to step into Arena and push all of your buttons before you die. Little goals like that will give you the feeling of progression, which is rewarding. And even like when you're losing, if you're still accomplishing your little goals, hopefully you'll be having fun and you'll be getting better, and you won't be worried too much about losing. At the end of the day, you don't learn very much from winning, you learn from losing. I'll also say that be patient. No one's gonna step into Arena for the first time, or the first time in a couple of years, and just become a god in 100 games, or even 1,000 games for that matter. Be patient. Think about how many Mythic Plus keys you've done, or how many raid bosses you've killed, and how long it's taken you to get to the point where you're at now. Assume that PvP at the very least is going to be, if you really want to reach the highest levels of PvP, it's going to be a similar grind. Now, if all you're looking for is to hit your 1600 or 1800, maybe even 2100 for your weekly vault and stuff, and you just want to have some fun while doing it and not feel like you're just zug mongoing around mashing buttons. 100, maybe 200 games are probably, you'll make much more progress than you realize. My second point is going to be add-ons, weak auras, things like that. Getting the right tools so that when you step into Arena, you have the information that you need, and you can start practicing about collecting all that information, knowing where to look at which times, and then making decisions based on that information. The first step to this, obviously, is to track your own cooldowns. Now, I would say, at least what worked well for me when I first got into Arena, is I left my whole user interface effectively the same as I was used to in PvE. I'm a big believer in like small iterative changes. I didn't want to step into Arena with a whole different set of keybinds and a whole different UI and then try and tackle that mess. So what I ended up doing was keeping my UI roughly the same as it was for the content I was used to playing. And then I set up a couple of small weak aura clusters, I guess, where I could put all my rotational abilities together and then all of my offensive cooldowns and defensive cooldowns together. And all I was really worried about was stepping into Arena and making sure that I was at least using all of my defensives and trying to use all of my offensives in every game. Because especially as a healer, it is very easy to panic and forget what buttons you have available to you. So making that sort of information as easy as possible that you can kind of figure out what your next move is going to be by just looking at a little action bar or something can be very, very useful. So I would recommend that. I would also recommend a few add-ons. Gladiator Losser is definitely one of them, and that's the one that a lot of people will be familiar with. It will text to speech certain cooldowns. Now, by default, it will basically yell at you, well, not yell at you, but it will alert you of a lot of things happening. It can be quite overwhelming to begin with. I think most people leave this as default and they just kind of learn to zone out all of the cooldowns that they don't want to worry about. But if it is too much to start with, it's still a fantastic add-on that you can, if you want to, tailor it down so it only yells out like the one major cooldown each of your enemy might be pressing. On top of that, Gladius is a very popular Arena Frames add-on. It will show you enemy cast bars and CC DR timers and all that kind of stuff. And big debuffs is very good for healers and DPS that have utility like BOP and things. So you can very easily tell when someone's kidneyed or when they need sack and things like that. All your general goal from your add-ons and weak auras and things, your UI in general, is just to get the information you need. I would say, like I said just before, small iterative changes are a good way to go about this. I probably wouldn't get all of the add-ons and all of the weak auras and everything all at once and then step into Arena and see how it goes. I would probably try one of them, play a couple of games, get comfortable, add the next one, and so on. The third step is to, as simple as it sounds, but the devil's in the details, is use your abilities. So once you have the information you need from your add-ons for both your party and the enemy team, the next step is taking actions based on that information. Now, the way I started with this was, like I said before, I just stepped into Arena and my whole goal was to just use all of my buttons before I died. Now, I played a healer, so this is going to be a little bit different for DPS, but the average player's goal should be, like I said at the start, to have a very rough outline of what you want to do. Have a target that you would like to kill, another target that you would like to disrupt or CC, or have a goal of protecting your healer in the opener and then trying to use all of your cooldowns to burst someone down, things like that. Now in solo queue, this is all going to be very chaotic, so don't read too much into having very, very specific plans. Just have a rough goal. Like if you're a paladin, go into every arena and, let's say a ret paladin, go into every arena and make sure that you're trying to use your sacrifice, blessing of protection, and wings and all that kind of stuff, all of your offensive cooldowns at the same time. And then once you're in the same game, all of those buttons in one game, once you're comfortable with that kind of thing, then you can start worrying about using wings at not so much the correct time, but a better time. So maybe you're going to try and force the enemy team to use some slows and roots and things, disables and things on you by just landing a good hodge or a repentance or something. And then after the enemies use their cooldowns to counter you in that situation, then you can press wings and not get countered. And it's that sort of like slowly refining your gameplay is what progressing in Arena is all about. The fourth point I would like to outline is probably the most important out of all of these, and that's going to be, I'm going to broadly encompass this as mentality. And like I said before, the goal in Arena isn't to win more games or all of your games, it's to lose to better opponents. The rating system in PvP is going to make sure is going to try and make sure that you as a player always have a 50% win rate. So if you win a couple of games, expect to then lose a couple of games to better players. And throughout all of this, your rating will climb. Again, like I outlined previously, modify your strategy as you go slightly. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you attempted something like a swap or some cross CC or hitting a different kill target or something, and it didn't work out, don't immediately throw those kind of strategies out the window. It could be something as small as your timing was slightly off. Maybe you swapped a little bit too early or a little bit too late, but that doesn't mean swapping was a bad decision entirely. A lot of this kind of stuff is going to come over time. You'll get a feeling for what works and what doesn't work. And I would also say that when you finish a round, especially of solo queue, when you're queuing up for the next one, take a minute to think. You don't have to analyze or overanalyze everything that went wrong in the previous game if you lost it, but it's helpful to focus on one thing. It doesn't even have to be the biggest mistake. Just pick something that you think that you didn't do particularly well last game and try and do a better job of it next game. Now, if you do this for long enough, you'll get Gladiator. I mean, that is pretty much how PvP works. As far as the playstyle difference from PvE to PvP, I find a lot of my friends get very, very frustrated stepping into PvP because they're used to having a plan, like their rotation, and then when they step into PvP and they can't do that rotation, it feels bad and they stress out and they think they're doing it wrong and the game sucks and all this kind of thing. Especially with people in PvE content who have learned over years that, even a single dead global is bad play. If you're on a raid fight or in a Mythic Plus or something and you're not filling every single global with buttons, you're doing it wrong. Now in PvP, that isn't the case. You will sit a lot of CC. It will be quite frustrating. You will not have 100% uptime. You will pop your cooldowns and sometimes you'll get absolutely nothing done with them. That's just part of the game. Nobody gets to do their optimal PvE rotation in PvP, but don't feel too discouraged or frustrated when you can't do that. This is why this whole section is about mentality, is that your mentality is very important here. If you pop your cooldowns and you force the enemy team to pop a defensive cooldown, oftentimes that's a win. Even if you're a rep paladin and you pop wings and you got one Templar's Verdict off before you got CC'd or the enemy team used a defensive or something like that, that's a win. If you press your offensive cooldowns and that forces the enemy team to press their defensive cooldowns, that's a win. As an extension to this point, for most of the time, like 95% of the time in Arena, you aren't actually trying to kill your opponents. You're not trying to kill your kill target all of the time. And what I mean by this is most of the time, most of your gameplay, the goal is to force your opponents to use a defensive cooldown, or it's forcing the enemy healer to spend mana, or you're forcing the enemy team into a different position. So a lot of the times you'll get people that pop all their cooldowns and then when they haven't killed their kill target, they feel like it's a failure. That isn't the case. A lot of the time, like I said, all you're really trying to do is trade cooldowns. You're trying to force the enemy team to press buttons. Now, if you do that fast enough and you do that enough times over the course of an arena match, then you will land a kill. But very, very rarely, especially as you climb up in rating, very rarely will you just outright 100-0 someone, especially in solo queue. I mean, if you're playing Rogue Mage, that's kind of the name of the game. But for every other comp out there, especially in solo queue, in these like less coordinated, no communication environments, you aren't trying to kill someone from 100 to 0. Now, that also means that a lot of the time, what target you're hitting as a DPS can be quite deceptive. I've played quite a few games with some friends who will tunnel vision one target, and maybe they'll cause that kill target's health to drop to 30% for a minute. And they'll think, oh, we were like, really close to a kill, and if I just did this, or if my teammate just did that, we would have definitely killed them. But the thing they're missing is that the person who dropped to 30% health still had 5 defensives to press. This is also why having the information with something like Gladius to see your enemy cooldowns is very important, because a lot of the times it isn't the person with the lowest health that is at most risk of dying, it's the person with the least amount of defensive cooldowns remaining, or the person in the worst position. This also means that sometimes you will lose a game that feels hopeless because it feels like you never really even got close to getting someone's health to 0. But in a lot of these situations, you can be much closer than you think you are, just because the cooldown economy is really what PvP is all about. And if you get someone to spend all of their defensive cooldowns and all you needed was like a little bit of uptime or one good cross CC or one good play to land a kill, but if you don't realize that because all you're doing is looking at health bars, it can throw you off a little bit. Finally, I would say be hypercritical of yourself, not your teammates. This is much, much easier said than done. Teammates will technically and often be the cause of many losses, but pointing fingers doesn't make you a better player. It also doesn't help you in the next game. I mean, obviously there are nice ways to do this. If someone does make a big mistake, you can just chalk that one up to a loss. Mistakes happen, and go on to the next game. You don't have to overthink everything about how if you just had better teammates, you would be much higher rating and so on. At the end of the day, you're there to have fun. So try and focus on the only player whose performance you really can improve, and that is your own. Now, if you do all these kind of things, I would say, even if you don't do all of them, even if you just do a little bit from each of these groups, I would say pretty much anyone can hit 1400. It might take a few games. You might be queuing for quite a while over the course of a week or 2 or 3 or 4, but I would say most people can get there. Now that's a minimum. I would say the maximum, really, you can go all the way. Most of the time, if you can hit 1400 and you pick one area of your gameplay to improve on and just keep queuing, you'll hit 1600 eventually. Once you've hit 1600, if you just keep queuing and it doesn't take much improvement to gain a lot of rating. If you just keep playing and just keep trying to tidy up certain aspects of your gameplay, especially as your knowledge increases, and you could queue into a team and instantly have an idea of who your kill target's going to be because you know which classes are more squishy than others, instantly know which cooldowns you have to be watching out for so that you don't die or get swapped to and that kind of thing. If you just have a rough knowledge of what specs are dangerous and why, and what your capabilities, like your specialization excels at, that will roughly get you to 1800. Anything beyond that, you are going to have a real plan and you are going to have to put in the work. But PvP is really fun and I'm excited to see a lot more people queuing in Dragonflight. So hopefully this video is helpful. Thanks for watching and algorithm stuff.